Hi, I'm Suzanne Ehlers, and this is Not Really Strangers, the podcast where we explore just how connected the refugee experience is to our everyday lives and to the social issues that matter most to us. Thanks for joining us for another conversation with a brand new guest, here to share the story of how they came to realize that their story and the refugee story were intertwined. By the end of this episode, you'll see that in this global community, the distance between us is often much shorter than we think. Let's dive in. Let's start off with you're introducing yourself, and if you could, your first memory of meeting me, and then I'm going to give you my first memory of meeting you.
Yeah, hi. My name is Nabin Dhimal. Thank you for extending this invitation. I met you in Geneva for the Global Refugee Forum. And it was so wonderful to connect with you and all the work that USA for UNHCR does. This was my first time being at the Global Refugee Forum and connecting with other fellow leaders. It was truly inspiring to think about how we can come together as a community and tackle the complex issues of forced migration.
Yeah, that's my first memory, not surprising, of meeting you. And I had only started my job at USA for UNHCR earlier that year. So it was also my first GRF, even though I had done a lot of United Nations types of meetings before. I'll tell you that talking with you and many of your colleagues, we were like not in the main hall, we were in that kind of expo area. And we had like just such a I don't know, just sort of like a free and sort of like casual connection, all of us, like coming from different walks of life, working on different sets of issues around forced migration and forced displacement and resettlement. And I remember just thinking like how at ease I felt with you and your colleagues, and how it really was confirmation for me that this role in this job was just such a wonderful sort of next step for me in my own journey. So I appreciated speaking of how welcoming you all were for me.
It was wonderful to connect and again just to get to know you and the amazing work that you're doing and the partnership that we have with USA for UNHCR.
Yeah. And we'll talk more about the partnership. We know that we are in challenging times on the issues that we work on, both locally, and I'll hear a little bit about that from you, but of course, nationally and globally. So that's, you have to have friendship and community to get you through tough times. So I'm glad that we've had a chance to build that. So let's go to a couple basic questions. So tell the listeners where you live right now.
So I currently live in Alexandria, Virginia. I just moved here last May, so it's just been a year now. I moved here for my graduate program. I'm currently a master's student in international migrations and refugee studies at Georgetown. But for the last 15 years, I lived in Portland, Oregon. This is where my family and I were resettled as refugees from Nepal.
From Nepal. All right. So let's first talk about Georgetown, because I know that very recently, and by the time listeners hear this, it will be a few months behind us, but you provided a really beautiful and generous introduction to the High Commissioner for UNHCR at the commencement address. Tell me a little bit about that opportunity. You did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was such a huge honor. I learned that usually citations of this type are done by faculty because we're honoring High Commissioner Grandi and his amazing work and all the humanitarian efforts that he has led for the last 40 years. The dean of SFS thought it would be special if a refugee who had the lived experience and to do that. And I was really honored. And it was really special. We had a dinner at the Kennedy Center, and he's just so wonderful and humble and down to earth. And to be able to connect with him, because I met him at the Global Refugee Forum in December, but we couldn't connect, and to be able to connect with him at a more personal level. Even at this stage, I think one of the things that I remember was he was just kind of joking, and even because I was sitting next to him, and he has such a great sense of humor, and he was so warm, and it was such a very special, and he gave us such a beautiful and powerful and timely message for the new graduates for the class of 2025. So it was really special.
Yeah. Congratulations. And I really agree with and support Georgetown's decision to ask someone of your stature and of your experience to do that introduction. And having seen the High Commissioner in action, he has, yeah, just a really beautiful way of authentically connecting. He's been so committed to this mission throughout his entire career. So, all right, so that's the story of Georgetown and Alexandria. I'm recording from DC, so we're probably just a few miles from each other, although it probably would take 50 minutes to drive because traffic is always so bad in this area. And then before that, though, 15 years in Portland, Oregon. So tell me a little bit about that resettlement experience and whether you feel that Portland became in many ways a new home for you and your family.
Yeah, so it was in the beginning it was very challenging because when we were, and I'll get to that in the end too, but when we were doing our resettlement process, my family, we have a big extended family. My mother has seven brothers, and some of them have some formal education. And my mother, in Bhutan, girls weren't allowed to go to school. So she has always been very close to her family side. And we lived, I mean, our hut in the refugee camp was tied together. So I grew up close to my grandparents and we were very, very close. And I think part of that home was being very connected with family. So when we were doing the process of, refugee resettlement, we later learned that, my grandparents and my uncles were going to be resettled in Maryland, and we were going to be resettled in Oregon. And I remember at the IOM's office, field office, where my mother asked, we would like to go where my dad is going. And then they looked it up where he was being resettled, and it was Oregon. It was Maryland, and then they told us we would be going to Oregon. And then she said, "Oh, how long would it take if we were to take a bus or like go there?" And they said, "No, you have to take a flight." And I just saw her just like breaking down, because she had been so connected with our family. And so we were very devastated and scared because we didn't know anybody. We were a big family of seven. So my brother was still in high school at that point. So it was very scary at times, but there were not a lot of other Bhutanese refugees that were resettled in Oregon. So we were the first one. So we didn't know anybody from our refugee camp who was gone there. So that added another layer of unfamiliarity and feeling like, what are we gonna do in this unfamiliar place? And we didn't even know how to pronounce Oregon. So when we came to Portland, the community was very supportive. We found our own community. It was very challenging in the beginning of the few years, but eventually we found our community, and we started started feeling like we belong. This is our home, and for now looking back, I wouldn't trade any place because Oregon and I think Portland was so special. My education, my upbringing about social justice, and the work that I'm doing now has really shaped. And I think Portland, in many ways, played a big role in where I am today and in the work that I do. So yeah, 15 years. It's a very special, and I hold very close to my heart.
Yeah, I mean that's that story of thinking, what close quarters you're living in, often in refugee camps and settlements, and that proximity to families across generations. And then the prospect of coming and thinking of your mom asking that question, well, how easily could I get there, right? How can I get
Mhm.
from Oregon to Maryland, and realizing it's not a bus trip and that it would have to be a flight. I mean, just sort of really feeling we have such an opportunity in front of us, and there will be sadness and loss in that as well in terms of distance. And here you are many years later, now on the East Coast and certainly closer to Maryland. You started to tell a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about the story of leaving home? And how many years your family might have spent in a refugee camp, and just give us some picture of that. I think the average American, frankly, doesn't always really understand what that step looks like of leaving someplace for fear of persecution, violence, and conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So my family has lived in Bhutan for many, many, many generations, as far as I think 1620. So in the early 1980s, the Bhutanese government decided to implement this new national policy. It was really, in a plain English, it was really an effort to ethnically cleanse this minority, which we were living in the southern part of Bhutan. So it became quite violent, and it became really unstable for us to be there. A lot of the community members were put in prison. Bhutan is sort of seen as this uh land of happiness. They don't track the GDP, but behind that, I think there's a lot more complex history of people being displaced, and my community being displaced in the early 80s. So my family was displaced from Bhutan in the early 90s, and I was born and raised in a refugee camp along with my sisters. My other three siblings were born in Bhutan, and we were there for close to 2 decades. I think it was 18 years exactly. And I think for me, the obviously, we were there for a long, long time, but I think the breaking point really came during the turning point, I would say, came in early 2008, where there was a big fire that took place and that destroyed 1,300 hertz along with our home. And then there's the one thing that I still cannot get erased from my memory. It's like I saw my parents cry for the very first time, which is very, very rare in our community, especially for male figures. Um, and I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm 29 now, and my parents were 28, and they had 5 kids, and they had been living in a refugee camp for almost 20 years, and they lost everything. And what must have they have, felt at that point? So I think, both of my parents have never gone to school. As I mentioned earlier, in Bhutan, girls were not allowed to go to school. So my mom felt especially more resentful going back to why she was not allowed to go with her siblings and her father, because her brothers and siblings were allowed to go to school, and she had felt that she had sacrificed her potential, and her brothers had gone and they had better prospect of coming to the United States. So she was especially more resentful, to not to be able to do that. And I think, initially my father was very was not convinced about applying for refugee resettlement at that point, because he felt he was a farmer. They were farmers in Bhutan for all their lives, and not having any education, they felt that they wouldn't have any prospect in the United States. But I think after the fire, that really, I think, made them realize how fragile, home or whatever that meant at that point for them. And everything they had saved up was that, and I think that played a significant, decision in saying that, well, we don't have anything. Like, they got displaced 20 years ago and they were doing well in Bhutan. They had their land, they had their farms, they were well off. And then when they lost everything, then they became, refugees in Nepal, and then yet they lost everything they had saved and had built in the last 20 years. And I think just seeing them break down and hug each other again, I had really, it's a cultural thing too, because I hadn't really seen my parents cry and hug. And I think that really made them realize that now we will take any chance at life, whatever comes. And in many ways, you asked me what home means. And I think for me, it has been not about the physical space. It has always been about being together, and being in community, and with all those challenges, we as a family were united and we were together and felt like we could get over anything really.
It's beautiful. I was thinking there's so many things that you said that resonate, thinking about what age you are right now and what your parents were doing at that same age, and how, often sort of older generations had so much more sort of responsibility kind of on their shoulders. And it's kind of hard for me to even imagine when I was 28 what choices your parents were making to navigate safety and security. Like, that just seems incredible. And then to watch also almost sort of a breaking point and a real display of such emotional intimacy between them, to say, we'll take what you just said, we'll take any chance, right? Like, we've lost it all again, like, let's take any chance. And how lucky for the United States that you and your family were resettled here. But they don't know that at the time. They're looking into just this future that feels so uncertain. It's a lot of, I feel like there's so much courage at the heart of these stories that, again, the sort of average listener doesn't understand. Like, what would it mean to just pack it up and do that with multiple children and think about education and think about health and
Hmm.
all of those pieces. So that's yeah, it's a really beautiful story. Thanks for sharing so much of that. And you started to talk a bit about home, talked about, sort of what your movement and sort of journey has looked like. I guess, sort of you've identified yourself as a refugee in a couple of occasions here. What do people think when you tell them you're a refugee? Sort of not me that's in the space or not your friends from Refugee Congress, but like someone on the streets in Alexandria, Virginia. Do you feel like there's kind of a real common refrain that right away people say, "Oh, refugee, I know you're this, or that"?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think when I again reflect on my life and my lived experience as a refugee, and who have lived half of my life in a refugee camp and half of my life here in the States, I think there's a common assumptions about refugees, and I think there's always this sense of pittiness and we often term that with, people feeling helpless, people who are vulnerable. And I think for most part, and in many contexts, that's certainly the case. But I think in my, experience, my childhood was extremely happy. I feel very fortunate to be able to say that as a refugee. Like, I had two loving parents, siblings who made me feel, and I'm also the youngest of five, so I maybe didn't have to worry about all of the things that my siblings were worried. Again, I'm thinking as I'm getting older at 29, like, what my parents were thinking, but in many ways, again, I think for me that refugee is just it was again, I had a very beautiful and a very happy childhood, and I think oftentimes, when I hear stories of other friends who are from refugee background and I hear their stories, that's not to say I didn't face any hardships or there were not any, you know material and resources that I lacked. But for most part, our refugee camp was very secure. And when we think about in the context of displacement now, and what we are seeing in the numbers of displacement, I feel as a refugee, I was very fortunate to have, I didn't have the best education, but I'm grateful that I was still allowed to go to school. I love education. I've always been an advocate, and school has played a big part of my advocacy and my experience. So yeah, I would just say, there's nuance, even with refugees, and I think we have to um, ask people, what it means, and I think there are certainly horrific things that refugees have gone, but they're also resilient and they are determined. So I would just say I would say thank you and for asking that, because I think it just brings up to the conversation we're having about what it means strangers and how do we get to hear each other's story and try to connect at the more deeper and in a human level.
Yeah, yeah. I so love the image of, and you said it several times, like I had such a happy childhood. And I think that's important for people to hear, that even in moments of such transition and leaving a place that had become dangerous or insecure for your family, that you can still build a home and you can still have sibling rivalries and you can still have, mom getting exasperated with the kids. Like that's
Hmm.
part of for me, that's part of the humanity of this story, is that it can happen to any of us at any time. And that's why I think USA for UNHCR, in partnership with you and many groups that you've worked with and allies, feel such a deep commitment to these families and communities who find themselves in such a circumstance. So we touched on this a little bit. Stranger. What does stranger mean to you? It's sort of a different kind of word than home or welcoming. Like, what does it mean to be a stranger to someone?
I think for me, I think stranger means misunderstood. Sometimes it could also mean excluded, unknown. And I think in my experience in the context, like when, as I mentioned, like I've lived 13, 14 years in a refugee camp. I was born and raised there. So we are Nepalese ethnicity, but we are Bhutanese Nepali. And I think I've struggled with my identity and sense of belonging and how I even identify. For many years, I used to say I was Nepali because that was more convenient because I do speak Nepali. I am Nepali culture. but then my parents are from Bhutan, and there's that complexity of why we became refugees. So in Nepal, we weren't accepted as Nepalese because again, my family had lived many generations in Bhutan. So they spoke Nepali, they practiced Hindu culture, they practiced all the Nepali festivals like Dasai, Diwali, and many other traditions. But we weren't accepted in Nepal, where we looked like them, we spoke like Nepalese, um, and there was a very derogatory term that was used. It's called Bhutange, and I think it just sort of translated as refugees from Bhutan. And there was an incident that happened. So I would say I was a very entrepreneur. Even in a camp, I used to work in the food cart when I was like 5 or 6 year old. That was my way of saving a little cash, and I would go and watch Bollywood movies on this small black and white TV that was powered by this cell battery. But I would just come up with different ideas how to make money so I could, because I didn't want to burden my parents, and then they frankly wouldn't be able to like afford to, where I could go. There was consider something extra. But I remember one time I was selling my notebooks. And this local at a local village, and this local person said, you can't trust Butangi, they he must have maybe stolen, or you should maybe just not give him the full price. And again, I've heard that term even in Nepal from different people, but I hadn't really experienced somebody had not said that to me. And I think at that point I felt like I am not from here, like I don't know where I belong. And I think I've sort of struggled with that, you know in Nepal. I don't know if like I would identify as myself as Bhutanese Nepali, but I have never been to Bhutan. I don't know anything about Bhutan. I lived in Nepal, but I don't know anything about Nepal in that context. Like, it's such a beautiful country. People ask me about Mount Everest. I lived in a refugee camp and have not really seen Kathmandu and Pokhara and other beautiful places that Nepal has. And I've been here in the States, and yet I don't feel American. I'm a US naturalized citizen. So I just carry this stranger. I think again, I would just say it's for me. It's just sometimes being misunderstood and misjudged, but I do think we have the ability to change that, such as with this podcast, Not Really Strangers. When we say, hey, tell me your story, where are you from, and what is your story? And I think that helps us connect and break that silo of like, how do we connect and how do we build that community. So yeah, I think with a lot of the questions, I think it's just it's with it comes with very layered and complexity of different lived experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, just thinking, first of all, it's not a surprise at all that you were entrepreneurial. Like I think that starts early, and I still see that in your spirit, and I've seen that in the way you interact with your work, or you think about advocacy that you do on behalf of resettled refugees, and quite frankly, on behalf of all sorts of people who are both vulnerable and maybe marginalized in society. So I love that image of you starting that work at such a young age. And your take on Stranger, it wasn't at all what I expected, but it totally resonates with me. I really understand, sort of not feeling, as deeply rooted in any one place, but certainly but rooted. Like you've been so focused on building community and thinking about family and thinking about connection, that it seems, it's like a bifurcated reality almost, of
Yeah.
having a label for oneself and a sense of identity, and then realizing that identity kind of stops short at a certain point because you've never been to Bhutan, or
Mhm.
people's expectations of what you would know about Nepal, even though the years that you spent there were largely, if not entirely, in a refugee camp. So yeah, just a very complex answer that gives, I think, me and the listeners a lot to think about. So you started to talk about this earlier, and I'd love to hear this notion of building community, and really maybe lessons learned. Like, what have you learned about building community? And that's either in the camp experience, that's in Portland, that's here in the Washington, D.C. area, and sort of a graduate school community. And what has it meant, and what does it take to build community in these times?
I really love that question. I really had to reflect on that. I think community for me, again, it's being vulnerable and being intentional. And I see that like as I shared earlier, like when I came in Portland, Oregon. Again, school was some place that I felt like I belonged and I excelled, and I was a really good student. And I felt really out of touch because I didn't speak the language and I couldn't really participate. And I think for me, the community was recognizing and realizing that maybe there are students like me who also felt that, especially refugees and ESL students whose English was not first language. I remember walking to my speech and debate coach at that point in high school and saying that and being vulnerable really and saying, hey, I don't speak the language and I'm not able to participate. I feel like I don't belong, and there are all these issues that I care deeply about and I want to be able to advocate, and I can't do that in a articulate and effective way if I don't have the skill sets. And he was just like a little struck with my thick Indian accent. I don't know how much of that made sense, but I think I was able to get the message across, and he was very supportive. And I joined speech and debate partly because I wanted to create community. And I go back to that piece of being vulnerability and being intentional. And I think in times like this, you know, if we just owe it up to ourselves and to the community that we want to create, that we don't know the answers and we don't know these are the things that I care about. I would like to invite you. Let's figure it out together. I think for me that has been the community, and that really helped me organize, International Youth Leadership Council. That was a model really at the national level to create leadership opportunities for ESL students. And the administration really listened. And then my community continued when I went to high school. I mean, when I went to university, where I was again really felt out of place as a first generation college student who didn't really know what it was. So then I created a mentorship program there that supported other refugees and migrants and many first generation college students. And I think it really started with me being vulnerable and saying, look, I am struggling. I don't know what I'm doing. And I want to figure it out together. And will you help me? And I think that has really been my way of building community, and especially in these times where situations are very difficult for a lot of communities, that if we just show up being vulnerable and authentic to ourselves and what the needs are, I think it will go a long way. Even if we don't have all the answers, um, it's a messy and it's organic, it's not linear, but at least we will be able to build that community and that sense of belonging that we all need and crave for.
You earlier in the conversation talked about just the importance of education, and I was thinking about work that I've done on girls' education and how Malala, as of course, a world activist on that stage, always would say, once you have education, no one can take it from you. It was something that she felt so fierce about, that anyone, young girls, boys, anyone, like once it's in here, it's yours to keep, and it sort of powers not only what you do, but then sort of also the heart that you have for others. And then I'm really struck that the example you gave around the work with youth and ESL, like you leaned into something that you knew was a challenge, right? You like, I want to almost like push myself to the edge to get better at this, and I'm going to put myself into the deep end in some ways. Like if you're feeling not confident about your English skills or your ability to articulate an argument, like the last thing some would do would be join the speech and debate club. And you did the opposite. You were like, no, that's actually where I'm going to be able to really like fine tune and perfect these skills and this expertise. For me, that it's vulnerability, and it's also like such total courageousness. And then modeling that for others to say, you can ask for help. You can say, like, I don't think I'm good at this, but I want to be better at this. And I know what others are going through. And so I want to sort of pave a way and say, this might be the right next step for you. This is what I've done. There's just so much in what you've talked about, back to being an entrepreneur and being a real, I think, model for problem solving sort of in your own life and education. That's really inspiring. So last question. I know you're busy. I'm not going to take up too much time. And this one was coming. I love the sort of practice of breaking bread together in a shared meal. And I've asked this question of all sorts of people over the years, but it definitely is a way that we can go from being strangers to being better connected. And so, if you were hosting a kind of a dinner party or a beautiful dinner table, tell me a little bit about maybe what you would serve or where you would want it to take place. And if you can think of a guest or two to share, just sort of paint a scene for some place that would feel really so welcoming and kind of gratifying for you to be building community at a dinner table.
Yeah, I love this question, especially because I'm a big foodie and
Mm,
I love cooking. I That's my way of, showing people around me that I love and I care. And I always have friends and family over for dinner and food. I think for me, when I think about a dish, again, being a big foodie, I've learned throughout the years many, many dishes. But one particular dish that just comes to my mind is just the traditional Nepali dal bhat, which is just means rice and lentil, and you can serve with curry, and of course you always have to end it with a strong cup of chai. I think that food is something that I always come back when I go travel for work or if I'm away from a vacation. The first thing that I automatically go towards is just that comfort. And I think partly because, even in a refugee camp, I think that was the food that my mom made. And it was just something, it's very simple, it's very nutritious, and it just reminds me of home. It reminds me of our history, where we come from. And I think that's something that I think Bhutanese and Nepalese would agree on is dal bhat tarkari. That's the dish that would that's a very typical and a very authentic dish that we make. And I think that's something that my family has carried with them, even in Bhutan. So they lived very, very far away from Nepal, many generations away, but that's what they were eating in Bhutan. And they continue eating that in Nepal, in a refugee camp, with whatever food we were provided. And then we continue doing so. Well, we have access to all sorts of groceries and food, and that's still something that we eat. And I think that just brings this comfort, and I think it just ties everything together for me of history and language and culture and being in community.
yeah, I love that. I love the notion too of making that dish, as you said, in so many different contexts. Sort of in sort of original places where it's rooted to places where your resources were constrained, to even a place like the United States where you could be making anything and yet you go back to a basic dish that just provides such a sense of kind of belonging and connection. It's awesome. Thank you for this really beautiful conversation. I feel like I know you better now as a friend and as a colleague and an ally. And meeting in December of 2023 in Geneva at the Global Refugee Forum, we obviously had a connection around mission and work, and how important both of us feel such a sense of purpose and drive for the communities that we serve. And so then today we did a little bit of that, but we also got just to connect as humans and talk a little bit about lessons we've learned and the leadership that we're both trying to model. So really honored that you took the time for the conversation, and I think we did well by the podcast title, Not Really Strangers, and hoping our audience explores the sort of complexity of that with us a little bit today after hearing this episode.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the invitation again. And love the mission and all the work that USA for University is doing and your efforts to connect and have more refugee voices and to share their stories. And I think, again, as the title of the podcast really articulates, we just have to ask, like, what is your story, and to be able to connect. And again, really enjoyed speaking with you, and honored to be the guest. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. Your time is valuable, and it means a lot that you've chosen to spend it here. You can find today's show notes, including how to connect with today's guest, at unrefugees.org/notreallystrangers. That's UNREFUGEES.org/notreallystrangers. While you're there, I hope you'll consider making a donation to the organization I lead, USA for UNHCR, to help us provide more support for refugees here in the US and around the world. If this episode was impactful, please take a moment to review the show and share the episode with a friend or family member. This small action will help us have a much bigger impact. Thanks so much. Don't be a stranger.